Hi everyone, we're going to review Chapter 4, Developmental, Environmental, and Learning Factors in Stuttering. So many factors both in children themselves and in their outside environments create conditions under which stuttering first emerges and then will either disappear or grow worse. So what we're going to look at are some of the factors are part of the child's normal development, such as the explosive growth of speech and language skills during preschool years. But other factors may be common environmental situations that most children take in stride as they grow up. Competing with siblings, getting attention during their parents' time that's being separated out for all the siblings, or looking at their busy home schedules. So we have to see that the developmental and environmental influences are not the cause of stuttering by themselves, but rather they have their effects by interacting with the sensory, motor, language, and emotional factors that we've discussed in previous chapters. So when we see the overview, we're looking at the constitutional factors, and then what are some of the developmental factors and environmental factors, and even learning factors that affect the stuttering onset and stuttering development. We know that developmental factors we see our children must deal with limited neural resources handling a multitude of tasks. So we all know that we all have brain circuitry. We have the right and left side of the brain. And we know that as children are growing and learning, that there is a competition for all that neural circuitry. Competition for motor skills, for speech and language skills. So motor and cognitive development compete for the cerebral resources. And there's even a rapid developmental change that we see in the vocal tract stress. Stress is the development of speech. And this is all occurring simultaneously. There's actually a domain of educated guesses and tentative conclusions. And we know that stuttering occurs when children are developing most rapidly during their preschool years. Some of the other things that we look at developmentally is we're looking at that competition for the neural resources. We're thinking about how children usually do not develop speech and language at the same time they're walking. We know that if you look at any child, that they will be focused on one of those developmental areas first, and another one develops later. So many children will start to walk before they start talking. But then again, you might see children that may have more speech and talking, and their motor skills may be more delayed or come afterwards. So environmental factors are in competition, as we saw before, with the incidence of stuttering. And we know that genes alone cannot account for the occurrence of stuttering in all children, but rather some other factors affect them. In this developmental factor, we see that the child is competing for neural resources, and that's why the brain must share its resources in coping with many of these demands. Children may become excessively disfluent, and that's disfluent, as other developmental demands outpace their abilities to coordinate the complex movements of rapid, articulate speech. So if there's a disparity between language facility and motor speech ability, that may have a contributing emergence of stuttering. We want to also look at some of the other ways that development can affect the onset of stuttering. So we know that between the ages of 1 and 6, that children grow by leaps and bounds and their bodies get bigger. The nervous systems are forming these pathways and new connections, and this perceptual and their motor skills will improve with maturation and practice. But sometimes what we also see is that all these enormous demands must also, as in speech, draw on language resources as well. And so there can be these challenges and found in children who stutter to be somewhat delayed as a group compared to non-stuttering children. But it's not always a clear-cut issue. We also consider the evidence that boys are slower than girls in their neuromotor development. And so boys can be more at risk of having unintelligible speech and also of stuttering. So there are many factors that we're taking into account. If we're looking at speech and language development, we see that stuttering seems to have its most frequent onset when the child is mastering more complex language, that there are children who are predisposed to stuttering, may have deficits in areas for planning and production of speech and language sounds, and that the rapid speech and language development may stress these weak areas, resulting in stuttering. So that not every child is going to be stuttering because they have the same factors affecting them. Some children are going to be more predisposed to stuttering than others. We also see that most stuttering begins between ages of 2 and 4. That's when children are acquiring new sounds and learning new words, almost by the hour. And we see that when stuttering begins before the age of 3, its onset coincides with the quality and quantity of the child's articulation skills, their phonology, morphology, and syntax. So it's not that we see that the demands of speech and language development cause the stuttering behavior, but we see that for many of these children, these demands may be a precipitating factor. So I want to say that again because I think it's really important to know that when stuttering begins before the age of 3, that we're not saying that the demands of speech and language development cause the stutter, but we're saying that for many children, these demands may be the precipitating factor. So which children are predisposed for stuttering? Something that we want to take a look at. And as the child develops more and more speech and it goes faster and longer complex sentences, they're knowing that the planning and production of speech and language may use atypical neural pathways that may be slow or inefficient, and these demands grow greater and greater, putting much stress on the system. And for many of the children who are developing stuttering behaviors, there is so many stressors, and that can affect their delays in initial sounds or syllables that may be repeated or prolonged or even blocked, waiting for the entire sentence to be put together in the brain. So it's almost like having a traffic jam, that there's so many aspects of formulating sentences that are going into play that it may be too difficult for that child's brain to handle and to master those moments. But many times when children are learning, this soon develops compensatory strategies, which paves the way for their normal speech, while other children have more of a difficulty bringing this fluent speech to fruition. Okay, so let's move on to, we do know one other thing that I'd like to point out is that research has found that many times speech and language difficulties are more common among children who stutter than those who don't. But again, the findings are not that simple and not that clear. And I think you're going to find that in this entire chapter, that there are some unknown unknown questions about stuttering that we always don't have the answer to. But there can be some hypothesize that delays in language development can be related to the stuttering because children with delayed language may become frustrated at their difficulty speaking. They may develop fears related to speaking, and then they may learn to stutter as an anticipatory avoidance response. And so you might see a child that has this difficulty with maybe they don't have the syntax that they need to develop their language sentences, and so they're ready to be speaking in longer sentences, but they may be unable to fill it in with verbal content, which makes repetitions and blocks possible as they try to go ahead with speaking, but they're just unable to. Cognitive development, we're looking at the intensive cognitive development may compete with fluency. We see that the growth of perception and attention, working memory, executive functions play a role in spoken language. And that's what the term cognitive development is being used in. There may be two ways in which cognitive development can affect stuttering. We can see that many times normal circumstances occur, that there may be a sudden change in the ongoing stuttering of a preschool child, and maybe their stuttering or disfluency gets worse, and then maybe suddenly it gets better. So there may be some ups and downs in the child's fluency reflecting the spurts of cognitive development. We also see that if we look at Piaget's preoperational period, that's 2 to 6 years of age, the child is going through a series of transitions in which new cognitive learning must be assimilated and consolidated with current knowledge. And this also is a time that their linguistic and cognitive systems are temporarily unstable. So they may be vulnerable at this point for disfluencies. Also, after age 3, the child may become self-conscious enough to have negative feelings around their stuttering. They may feel embarrassed. They may feel shamed. They may feel guilty. It was noted that emotions such as the embarrassment and shame arise from the increasing cognitive maturity of children who stutter and their peers, and so this can play an important role in the discomfort that the children feel when they do have stuttering behavior, and this may affect their persistence of stuttering. When we look at the social and emotional development, we see that this can interfere with speech, that we see that many times parents will reflect that children seem to stutter when there was an increased arousal or emotional arousal, when they get very, very excited. They want to tell their parent about something that happened, and they're so excited, and the emotional system kicks in, that there may be an increase in the stuttering and that normal disfluency. We might see this because the speech and language neural networks and structures are immature. They're not fully myelinated yet. They may be buffered with that from the crosstalk or the interference by that limbic or the emotional system structure. And so this can be affecting the regulation and expression of their emotion. And this interference may be triggered, the stressors of emotional stress during childhood may trigger or worsen stuttering. And some of the children who stutter because of a sensitive temperament may be more vulnerable to normal stresses of childhood. We know that those children who are predisposed to stuttering, that their slower maturing speech and language functions may not be optimally localized or insulated from interference and may be closer to centers of emotion in the right hemisphere. So when they're emotionally aroused, the fluency may suffer because neural signals for the properly timed and sequenced muscle contractions may be interrupted in some way. As a matter of fact, many parents report for the first time that they noticed their child was stuttering was during something that was highly excitable or they were highly excited about. And individuals who stutter appear to be normal in terms of their psychosocial traits, which is to state that normal disfluency occurs for all people, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that psychosocially that there are difficulties psychologically with that individual. We're looking at their neural circuitry. We're looking at their ability to handle speech, language, linguistics, syntax, all at the same time. And that's really something that the brain has to cope with. And the young child who's just developing that myelination and such of the brain may not be able to have that buffer and be able to handle all these different stresses coming into them. We also see that as a young child grows older, other members of the family besides the mother can play a role in their social and emotional changes. And though father and siblings can have part of that support system, the child may resent having to share their mother's attention. This may elicit feelings of anger, and that may translate into some more transient disfluency or stuttering in some children. And as we see too, there are many times that children, when their siblings show up on the scene, this can also trigger some difficulties of their feelings, provoking resentment for the birth of a sibling. And as I mentioned to you the other night, that was one of the families that I was able to help with their child's young girl who was stuttering, was by giving her additional time, individual time away from the sibling, to help her with her getting that reconnection with her own parents. So let's look now at some environmental factors that may interact with developmental factors to trigger or worsen stuttering. There's mixed results about whether parents of stutterers are more anxious. And the theory is that children with vulnerable temperaments may have inherited from one or both parents, so these parents may be perfectionistic or anxious. We see that the families may find that they criticize their child when the child became disfluent if they're more perfectionistic. But then there's also the research that shows that even though one child in the family may be a child who exhibits stuttering, there may be other children in the family who do not. And they all are the children of the same perfectionistic parents. So again, we have to take a look at which children are more predisposed to stuttering than those that are not. We also see that the child that may begin to stutter may have picked up their parents' dismay. They may become self-conscious, so that even though they had minor disfluencies, with adding some additional tension and struggle from what they deemed to be their parents' perfectionistic attitude, they may have developed into more noticeable stuttering. So that some children actually are more hypersensitive to their parents' concern about that increased tension, and with that may be a source of their increased disfluency. When we look at the speech and language environment, the research is very unclear. Do families of children who stutter have stressful speech and language models? And there is some speculation about some variables that cause stress for vulnerable children. We see that Van Riper in like 1973 stated that stuttering usually begins at the very time that great advances in sentence construction occur, and it seems tenable that when the speech models provided by the parents or siblings or the child are too difficult for them to follow, faltering can ensue. And so we see that stressful adult speech models, these might be possible stress and language stresses. There may be rapid speech rate from the parent, a polysyllabic vocabulary, complex syntax, or use of two languages in the home. We also see that stressful situations can occur for the children as well. And so we see that if there's competition for speaking, which was the case of the child, one of the children that I worked with, or frequent interruptions. If there's a demand for display of speech, that's, oh, show your grandma how you said this and that, putting the child on display. There may be a loss of listener attention if the child sees that somebody's not interested in what they're saying. How about when they're hurried when speaking, or frequent questions? Maybe they're excited when speaking. They have so many things to say. All of these can be stressful situations that can induce more of the disfluent or stuttering behavior. What about life? When we see that children who stutter may be helped by making communication easier, so what are some of the things that we can do in a clinical setting, or what are some of the things that we might want to do to assist the child's family? Always remember that when you're working with stuttering behavior and you have a young child that you're working with, getting the family involvement is critical, because you want to take a look at that environment in which the child is placed, and you want to see if there's ways that you can alter that environment and affect change in that child's fluency. So some of the things that you might want to look at is, as one of the things I did, which was very successful, was give more one-on-one time when the parent can listen. It's really important to give those messages clear to your child, that you're there for them, that you're listening, that what they say is very important. Also, we find that sometimes a slower speech rate can be very helpful, where the parents are able to slow down their rate and help the child determine that they too, there's more relaxation in the family without the stress. Another area that can help them is language complexity is not too far above the child's level. So not expecting the child to be able to speak in an adult fashion, expecting them to give you a lot of linguistic coding and sentence structure unless that is where they are developmentally. That's really very important. So again, these are some of the things that we want to look at, some generalizations we can make about actually different aspects of a parent's speech that are thought to increase stuttering, and those are speech rate, the frequency of interruptions, the frequency of questions, and the complexity of language. And these are things that we can look at and trigger, and when we're working with our children in a therapeutic situation. Let's now look at life events. These are important to take notice of that may precipitate or worsen stuttering in some children. So that we may see that if a child's brain pathways for speech and language are slightly compromised, that these events may really trigger stuttering behaviors to begin. Things like a child's family moves to a new house or a new neighborhood or a new city. A child's parents separate or divorce. These are so stressful for the child. That can worsen stuttering. These are actually stressful for anybody, and you may not even have people that stutter because of them, but they're very, very high up on the list of emotional trauma and difficulties in life situations. The family member is hospitalized or a child is hospitalized. The parent loses their job. An additional person comes to live in the house. How about a sibling? New baby's born. One of both parents go away frequently for a long period of time. Holidays or visits occur, which cause a change in routine, and there may be a discipline problem that involves the child. So in a few cases, traumatic life events can appear to precipitate stuttering in children, as well as in adults who appear to have no predisposition to stuttering. If we take a look now at learning factors, how then does a learning factor cause more stuttering? What is occurring? We find that learning can create more severe stuttering. Barry Guittara, the author of the textbook that we're using, talked about his own stutter, and he says that learning created more severe stuttering symptoms as he went through elementary school, junior high, and high school. And he was finding that a good therapist that he had helped him to reduce those symptoms to mild forms of stuttering, and that's what he has today. There are specific types of learning that are referred to at different kinds of conditioning, and these different types of conditioning can help affect change or help to strengthen a stuttering behavior. Things we look at are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and avoidance conditioning. So let's take a look first at classical conditioning, something that we probably already are quite aware of. It begins with two things naturally associated, our Pavlovian dogs, where he has food and he noticed salivation of the dog. Then he introduces a neutral stimulus, which was the bell, which is an unconditioned stimulus, which is then paired with the food that is our stimulus that we see, and then we have, because we have the bell that is ringing, which is the neutral stimulus, and then we see the dog is salivating because he sees the food, so he's paired the unconditional stimulus with the neutral stimulus, and we see the unconditional stimulus, which is the salivation. Now he has the conditioned stimulus, which now elicits the conditioned response. It's really simple. I'm making it way too complex. But that's our system for classical conditioning. So again, let's go over that one more time. So a stimulus that reliably elicits a response must be present. This stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus, that's UCS, and the response it elicits, which is usually reflexive or hardwired, and that's called the unconditioned response, the UCR. Then a neutral stimulus that doesn't elicit anything particular, that's the bell, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So this neutral stimulus is now called the conditioned stimulus, or CS, because it will be conditioned to elicit a response. And after repeated pairing of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, which reliably elicits the unconditioned response, the now conditioned stimulus is then presented without the unconditioned stimulus, and voila, The conditioned stimulus now elicits the unconditioned response. And there we have our Pavlovian dog. Take this classical conditioning of stuttering. That stuttering elicits feelings of dread, tightening of speech muscles. Stuttering with the accompanying dread and muscle tension occurs repeatedly on the phone, which was before neutral. Now, the phone elicits the dread and the muscle tension. So here's the person thinking now, oh gosh, I have to make a phone call, and they're afraid because they've paired that together. And then they say, I know I'm going to stutter. There's a tightening of their muscles, and they dread using the phone. An example of classical conditioning and stuttering is more like that tension response. And here we see there's a little boy that has just easy stuttering. The girl, sister perhaps, has a neutral response and a neutral stimulus, and so the boy is saying, what's your name? He's asking the girl. So it wasn't a sister, it was somebody he didn't know. Well, what's your name? And then we have a listener who's critical, and the child feels embarrassed. So now we have an unconditioned stimulus. And now the unconditioned response we're having is the child is getting tense stuttering because he's saying, when can we go? And we've got someone stern, dad perhaps. Why don't you stop and start again? Critical. And that's almost what we heard when Rigo was talking about what his dad said. And then what happens is now he's back with the girl. And now what's happening is she's the continued stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and he's got his conditioned response, which is now tense stuttering. And so he says, Mama, my papa, dad says, I have to go. So what was once easy stuttering with a neutral stimulus begins to become tense stuttering when he has someone critical, which is now the unconditioned stimulus, and now down to continuing to keep this tense stuttering going. So the experience of stuttering or the anticipation of the stuttering elicits the tension response even in the absence of any threatening stimuli. Before, our little boy Richard used to stutter with only easy disfluencies in friendly situations like talking with mothers or playing with peers, but now he stutters with tension and hurries in those situations because the stuttering or these anticipation of this triggers the tension response. And more it happens, and more it will continue to happen. In the area of operant conditioning, we know that if behavior is followed by a reward, it increases. So the parent may say good talking after the child says 5 fluent sentences, and the child's fluency will increase. If behavior is followed by punishment, it decreases. So the parent says, can you say truck again after the child stutters, and the child's stuttering will decrease. If a behavior reduces negative stimulation, it is negative reinforcement or escape, and it increases the behavior. So here we have the man saying, I went to the Big Apple. And in this example, this young man escapes from the stutter on the and by substituting the Big Apple for New York. Head nod is also an escape. We see that there are different, in operant conditioning also, it's a component of every stuttering treatment program. It's very powerful too, that affects frequency of the behavior. For example, if you're working with a preschool age child who stutters, one effective approach is to help the parent arrange a situation in which the child is fluent, then praise that fluency to reinforce it. After it's been done many times, the frequency of the child's fluent utterances will increase. Remember that the environment in which the operant conditioning takes place is important. Therefore, to increase that child's fluency where it counts, you want to have the clinician teaching the parent to elicit fluency and praise them in the home. With a child, very mild punishment might be used occasionally to help them learn to use the fluent speech instead of stuttering, but that has to be done with great care and monitoring. Just going back to that area about punishment. With a child with very mild punishment, it might be used occasionally, like I said, but it must be done with great care and careful monitoring. Whenever punishment is used, reward is also an important part of a treatment plan. So much reward and little punishment is a good motto. Now, Van Riper pioneered the use of mild self-punishment to be used with adults who stutter, using a procedure he called cancellation. So there are 3 procedures that Van Riper used looking at some mild punishment. One was cancellation, the second is called pull-out, and the third was a preparatory set. So in cancellation, the client stopped talking immediately after they had one of their typical tense stutters. Then in silence, they planned an easier, more relaxed way of stuttering the word. The silent pause was mildly punishing, and thus the frequency of the tense stutters decreased. Uttering the word easily after the pause was rewarding, and the frequency of the relaxed stutters increased. And that's Van Riper's example of cancellation using some mild punishment. Another area he did was pull out, where he taught clients to stop in the middle of tense stutters and hold on to the sound that they were stuttering until they could relax their muscles. And the muscles that were tense, preventing them from saying the word. When they finished the word, they were in a more relaxed, slow manner. They were able to continue their conversation. And the last area for operant conditioning that Van Riper used was a preparatory set. And that's where they pause momentarily before the word on which they expected to stutter and put their speech mechanisms more into a relaxed state. So by combining these 3 operant-based techniques with classical conditioning to reduce the client's negative emotions, Van Riper had a therapeutic package that effectively taught stutterers to stutter in such easy ways that they sounded more like a normal speaker. Looking here again, going back to this operant conditioning, here's a method to reduce the negative stimulation, the negative reinforcement, or the escape. An anticipating stutter, doing something to keep it from happening. So in this case, here's somebody saying, I went to New York. In this case, he avoids stuttering on the feared word New York by saying several times. But we see that many times if you help people who reduce the stutter with the avoidance behaviors, sometimes it may be difficult to get rid of the avoidance behavior because the person doesn't dare want to find out what would happen if he didn't do it. But one of the example ways that you might try helping somebody who has a feared word without saying is by beginning it slowly and deliberately with a preparatory set, like Van Riper talked about, instead of using a pull-out. If stuttering occurs, it's sometimes important to teach a client what to do when they're afraid they'll stutter before teaching them what avoidance behaviors not to do. So trying to give somebody something positive to do to replace what that fear is of when they're going to stutter with something more positive. Some individuals who stutter will stop using avoidance behaviors without having to work directly on them. Many times just directly improving the fluency, for example, will often decrease the avoidance. And that's really particularly true for children who may be avoiding a few words or speaking situations, but have not developed a widespread pattern of avoidance yet. For them, learning how to speak more fluently will reduce their fear of stuttering, enough so that they are motivated to approach all the speaking opportunities presented to them. So here are some of our clinical implications. What can we do as therapists? What can we do to deal with the ways of approaching reduction of stuttering behaviors? To deal with classical conditioning, you need to decondition, associate a behavior with a neutral stimulus. Have a client keep stuttering until the fear is gone, so there's no negative stimulus. Counter conditioning, you associate a behavior with a positive stimulus, which is what we have been usually classically conditioned. So you have the client stutter and receive praise for keeping it going. That would be a positive stimulus. To deal with operant conditioning, you need to stop the reward for unwanted behavior. So have the client not release a word immediately after a tense squeeze or a head nod or an eye blink or other escaping behavior. Start the reward for the wanted behavior. So have the client stutter to easy prolongation before the release, and that's the reward that's given. To deal with avoidance conditioning, you need to decrease the fear of stuttering. If the client avoids by saying as in my name is Barry, have the client practice saying and stuttering on Barry. And also learn to reduce the tension and release the word more easily while they're in the stuttering. Reward non-avoidance. Have the client practice saying my name is Barry without the but with an easier stutter on Barry. And reward this emphatically. So some of the language factors that were shown Brown that adults who stutter do more on consonants, sounds and word initial positions, sounds and contextual speech, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, longer words, words at beginnings of sentences, and stressed syllables. The loci, the frequency of stuttering are different in preschool children. Stuttering in preschool children occurs most frequently on pronouns and conjunctions, the ands, the buts. These occur frequently at the beginning of utterances in young children. Stuttering most frequent adds repetitions of parts of words in single-syllable words and sentence initial position. And in summary, because the stuttering in preschoolers tends to occur at the beginning of syntactic units, this trigger seems to be linguistic planning and preparation. Many conditions have been found which reduce or eliminate stuttering. These include speaking when alone and relaxed, in unison with another speaker, to an animal or an infant, in time or rhythmic stimulus when singing or when singing in a different dialect. We know how many singers that we know, like the ones that you saw on YouTube's, who, when they talk, are disfluent or show stuttering behavior. When they sing, they're fluent, and you wouldn't know that they're stuttering. While simultaneously writing and swearing, there's no stuttering behavior. In a slow, prolonged manner, under loud masking noise while listening to delayed auditory feedback, that's the DAF, delayed auditory feedback. I use that many times with my people that were stuttering. And when you have that delayed time, then it's difficult to stutter using masking noise. When shadowing another speaker, when reinforced for fluent speech. And fluency-inducing conditions have been explained as resulting from reduced demands on speech motor control and language formation. So the facts about stuttering imply the following. Stuttering is an inherited or congenital disorder. It first appears when children are learning the complex coordinations of spoken language. It emerges in those children whose speech production system is vulnerable to disruption by competing demands of language, cognition, and emotion. And after it emerges, it becomes persistent in some children, perhaps those whose stuttering arouses substantial negative emotion, which leads to a variety of learned behaviors. The stuttering model shows a disorder of neuromotor control of speech. It's influenced by language production, and it's perpetuated by temperament and complex learning and the response of their environment to their speech. And this is the end of our discussion of developmental, environmental, and learning factors in stuttering.